Welcome to the Teaching Football Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Debates. Thank you for watching and sharing with your family and friends, and remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons at the end of this video. In this episode, part 2 of the upper room for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. In part 1, we looked at the offensive players and the special teamers. In this episode, we're going to look at the defensive players and the coaches that we think should belong in the upper room of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Now, as a reminder, this is not an original idea of mine. The original idea came from an interview with Deion Sanders a few years ago where he suggested that there be an upper room of the Pro Football Hall of Fame for players that stood out for their greatness, in a sense, icons. In August of 2025, Pro Football Talk put together a list of the people that they thought should belong in that upper room. And that's the list that we're using for our basis. In the previous episode, we did the offensive players and special teamers. This episode, we're doing the defensive players and the coaches. Then at the end of this video, we're going to talk about my thoughts as to how they select people for the icon room. And I'm going to include someone that I thought was omitted from the Pro Football Talk article. And once again, we're not including any owners like the articles originally had, because I'm not a huge fan of the professional owners, as you can see if you wanted to watch my episode on money hungry ownership. But with offense and defense, those are different aspects of the game, besides the obvious ones. The common phrase is offense sells tickets, defense wins championships. If you have a great defensive team, like the 2000 Ravens or the 85 Bears, a lot of times those games seem boring because the opposing offense is 1-2-3 punt, 1-2-3 punt, 1-2-3 interception, or whatever the case might be. Those defenses were so dominant in the sense they made the games boring because the other offense couldn't do anything. All their offense had to do was get a couple of touchdowns, so 14-0, 14-3 game, and the game is over in a sense. But defense is different from the fact that defensive players need to be, in a sense, more physical than offensive players. They need to be more intimidating, and they want to be respected. And I think that's one big difference from defense to offense. Both want to be respected for their mutual talents. But the defensive side of the ball, that's more of, for lack of a better term, manly side of the ball. That's where guys can be more physical and more intimidating. And that's where they demand that respect. As Hall of Fame college coach Lou Holtz said, being respected is more important than being popular. And that's the defensive side of the ball. By intimidating, by dominating your opponent, you earn that respect. And that's what defensive players are going for. So to begin with, on the defensive side of the ball, we're going to look at the defensive tackles. We're starting with, at the top, number 75. Pittsburgh Steelers great, Mean Joe Green. He was often called the I-beam of the Steel Curtain defense. He was the key player in that defense. He was the earliest one drafted for that dominant defense, playing that defensive tackle. He was sometimes considered dirty, but he was physical. He was intimidating. He demanded to be respected. He was the first player that I remember seeing dominating. Next, number 74, Bob Lilly, defensive tackle for the Dallas Cowboys. Key member of their early championship runs at the front end of the Super Bowl era. Super Bowls 4, 5, or 5, 6, 7 in there, when they played in a couple of Super Bowls, won one Super Bowl. But he was one of the early great defensive tackles. For a time, it was he and Joe Green were the two most dominant ones in the league. Even with those two dominant players, you still had Alan Page, number 88 of the Minnesota Vikings, part of the Purple People Eater defensive line for the Vikings teams in the 70s. He's one of only two defensive players to ever win the NFL MVP award. And he was a defensive tackle. Dominant, very smart, as by the evidence of his later career of being a Supreme Court justice in the state of Minnesota. But a great player against the run, against the pass, and like I said, one of only two defensive players to win a defensive MVP award in NFL history. Next to him, you have John Randall, another Minnesota Viking. In a sense, he kind of represents the undrafted players on this entire list. Being an undrafted player, he was challenged to, in a sense, make the team. And he was absolutely relentless for the next decade plus when he played in the NFL. Almost exclusively with the Vikings. At the end of his career, I believe he played for Seattle for a little bit. But he was at times not blockable in one-on-one situations. Next, you have Randy White. His nickname was the Manimal, another Dallas Cowboys defensive tackle. He was originally drafted as a middle linebacker, but they ended up moving him to a defensive tackle. He was smaller and lighter, but a little bit quicker than most of the defensive tackles at the time. He was part of that doomsday defense in the late 70s of the Cowboys. There's a great clip of him running down a wide receiver 50 yards downfield. He was a defensive tackle who started to rush the quarterback. I believe they're playing the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles completed a quick slant, and the receiver tried to run away from him, and he ran him down. And that even with the receiver having about a 5-yard head start. So dominant, great defensive tackle who sometimes some people considered him overlooked in that doomsday defense, but definitely one of the better players on that defense. The next group we're going to look at are the defensive ends. And starting with another number 75 who definitely belongs in the icon room is Deacon Jones. He was a defensive end on the fearsome foursome, the Los Angeles Rams D-line, and he's the guy that coined the term quarterback sack. He's also the guy that changed the rule that you can no longer head slap an offensive lineman. Because there was one year where he had a wrist or forearm injury, and before every game, the officials would check his soft cast that he had to make sure it was legal. And it was. And then on the sideline, before the game started, he would stick a piece of metal on the inside of that cast so that way he could head slap and daze an offensive lineman to give himself an advantage. But he was a great defensive end, coined the term quarterback sack. Sacks didn't become an official statistic until, I believe, 1982. So we need to give him respect for coining the term. The next defensive end is Gino Marchetti, number 89 of the Baltimore Colts. He was part of the early Colts teams in the front end of the Super Bowl era, one of the first great defensive ends, one of the first dominant defensive ends. He was an 11-time Pro Bowler, 9-time first-team All-Pro. So while he's not necessarily as well known as more recent defensive ends or some of these now outside linebackers that we call edge rushers, he was one of the first really great defensive ends. Next, you have number 78, Bruce Smith, the all-time sack leader in NFL history with 200 sacks. He played for the Buffalo Bills of the early 90s that went to 4 straight Super Bowls. In some ways, I think he was underrated as a run defender, but it didn't matter if he was one-on-one blocked, double-teamed, whatever. He always seemed to be getting to the quarterback and putting pressure on the quarterback. Next, you have number 92, Reggie White, the Minister of Defense. Number 2 on the all-time sack list with 198. But he's also known as being the first real free agent. In the early 90s, the NFL started what we now know as the modern free agency system. And Reggie White was the first real free agent star to sign with a different team. He started in Philadelphia, then he ended up going to Green Bay, winning a Super Bowl with the Packers, playing in another one. White also developed his own pass rush move where he would get an offensive lineman going in one direction, and then he would get his arm underneath the arm of the offensive lineman, kind of in his armpit, and use his momentum against him, throw him to the side, and then get to the quarterback. And the last defensive end is number 85, Jack Youngblood of the Rams of the 70s and late 70s and early 80s. Many people consider him one of the toughest players to ever play the game. During the run the Rams had going to the Super Bowl, where they eventually lost to the Pittsburgh Steelers for Pittsburgh's 4th Super Bowl championship of those 70s teams, Youngblood played the entire postseason with a broken fibula. Rarely came out. He wasn't as effective at all times as he was when completely healthy, of course, because he's got a broken bone in his leg. But he was still a factor and still a presence and still someone that teams had to account for in the postseason and still helped the Rams to make a respectable showing in that Super Bowl game. Now we're going to look at the middle linebackers, kind of one of the more glamour positions in defense, one that most people are more familiar with. And we're going to start with number 51, Dick Butkus, the first original true monster of the Midway for the Chicago Bears, the guy that defined toughness in the 60s and 70s. He was for a long time, for 40 years, considered the best middle linebacker in pro football history and one of the most feared players in pro football history. Next, you have Jack Lambert, number 58 of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Many consider him the best linebacker or best middle linebacker of the 1970s. He was 6'4", about 215, 220 pounds coming out of college. He became a key member of not just the Steelers Steel Curtain defense, but because of his abilities, he helped develop what eventually became known as the Tampa 2 defense. Part of his ability, part of his greatness was the fact that he could run down the middle of the field with tight ends when most middle linebackers of the 70s were bigger, slower, more of a run-stuffing middle linebacker. Lambert was all that, but he could also run down the middle of the field and cover, in a sense, the deep middle zone. At the end of the 1970s, the Steelers had a young safety on their roster by the name of Tony Dungy. Dungy used those ideas from former assistant coach Bud Carson with the help of Monty Kiffin, turned that Steeler defense, those concepts, into what has become known as the Tampa 2 defense. Next linebacker in the bottom left corner is number 63, Willie Lanier, one of the best linebackers in the late 60s going into the 70s. He was a middle linebacker for the Kansas City Chiefs when they won the Super Bowl number 4 against the Minnesota Vikings, and was a great dominant middle linebacker in more of the traditional role, run stuffing, controlling tackle to tackle. He did not run up the middle on the Kansas City Chiefs very well or very often. Next, you have number 52, Ray Lewis of the Baltimore Ravens. He's now considered the best middle linebacker to ever play the game, and it's hard to argue that. He's one of the most physical players that I've ever seen. In a way, he's a throwback not to just earlier football, but incredibly violent football, like back to the 40s and 50s, when players were out to, in a sense, injure the opponent, not just tackle him. But one part of Ray Lewis's game that I think is highly underrated was his zone coverage abilities. He was very intelligent on to how to play his zone, dropping in the correct area, and then anticipating where he needed to go when reading the offensive route, so that way he could be in position to either make an interception or, more commonly, make a big hit. But a great physical, dominating middle linebacker in the run, better than most people considered in pass coverage, but definitely a very good zone coverage linebacker. And lastly, number 55, Junior Seau, played most of his career with the San Diego Chargers, ended it with the New England Patriots. He never got a Super Bowl ring, but he was part of that Patriots team, or went undefeated during the regular season, and then just missed out on a perfect season when they lost to the Giants in the Super Bowl. He was the force that kept the San Diego defense at peak level for most of the 80s and into the 90s. Even though those Chargers teams, some of them weren't very good, their defense was always well above average, and at times even excellent. Oftentimes they were some of the best defenses in the league, even though they had terrible offenses. But he was also a key member of the Chargers team that ended up going to the Super Bowl in the mid-90s. Next, we have outside linebackers. Most of these players are generally off-the-ball linebackers, but that outside linebacker position is now somewhat considered an edge player. We'll talk about a couple of those players here in a moment. But the first one is number 60, Chuck Bednarik. And he's a pre-Super Bowl era player, but I think he needs to be included here. He was one of the last, if not the last, two-way players. He was an offensive lineman, I believe a center, and then an outside linebacker. He also had one of the first big televised hits in pro football history, and you can find it on YouTube. Eagles were playing the New York Giants. Frank Gifford was a wide receiver / running back, basically a Christian McCaffrey type of player for the Giants. Gifford caught a pass. He was trying to get to the sidelines, get out of bounds, and he didn't pay attention to where Bednarik might have been. And Chuck knocked Frank out cold. Vicious hit. Frank Gifford did not play football for an entire year. Basically, he was concussed and sat out the entire next year recovering. But it was the first big televised hit in pro football. That, and you combine with the fact that Chuck Bednarik was a Pro Bowler and an All-Pro on both sides of the football, you have to include him in this list as an icon. Next, you have number 78, Bobby Bell of the Kansas City Chiefs. He played alongside Willie Lanier and Buck Buchanan, three great linebackers for those Chiefs teams of the early 70s. Bell is considered the first prototype outside linebacker, or in a sense like that will type of linebacker, or weak side type of linebacker. where he's more of a speed player, drop into coverage and run and attack the ball, but more using his speed in combination with his physicality to stop an offensive player, whether it's a ball carrier or a receiver. Next, you have number 55, Derrick Brooks of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers of the late 90s and early 2000s. Another player, long career, multiple Pro Bowls, multiple All-Pro nods, a leader of that first Super Bowl winning Tampa defense. Always seemed to be around the ball. And again, he's just like Bobby Bell. Off the ball linebacker, could come up and stuff the run, drop into coverage using his speed more than his physical size as a great outside linebacker. The next one, number 59, Jack Ham, the third Steeler on this defensive list. Many consider him the best outside linebacker to ever play the game. He's overshadowed a bit by Joe Green and Jack Lambert because they were more vocal players. They're the ones that the media sought out more. Jack Ham wasn't as big of a talker. Many people consider him the best outside linebacker to ever play the game. From that off the ball, more of the drop back coverage, come up and support the run type of linebackers. Next, you have the first of two of the modern edge type of outside linebackers in Lawrence Taylor, the other defensive player to win NFL MVP honors. He, in a sense, changed football. In the 1980s, he was the number 1 overall pick out of North Carolina and began turning the Giants defense into an absolute force. There were times when he would toss offensive linemen aside like they were little running backs. If you had a running back try to block him, you might as well just have your quarterback drop back about 10 yards, take a knee, and consider himself down because a running back was not even going to slow Taylor down. You can find his highlights everywhere all over YouTube, but Taylor was the first real dominant edge type of rusher, outside linebacker that helped the Giants get 2 Super Bowls in the mid to late 80s and kept them in the playoff contention every year. And lastly, you have number 58, Derek Thomas of the Kansas City Chiefs, the other outside linebacker / edge rusher that belongs on this list. He still holds the NFL record with 7 sacks in a single game and was virtually unblockable. Unfortunately, his career was cut short due to injuries suffered in a car accident where he was paralyzed, and a few years later, as a result of those injuries, he unfortunately passed away. But he was one of those players like Lawrence Taylor. In a sense, we went from Taylor to Derek Thomas as dominant edge rushers. Taylor's career was just ending, while Thomas's career was just starting to take off. Next, we have a little bit more of a glamour position on the defense, the cornerback position. And this is one where we have more players in the icon room to choose from, mostly because of the variety of the abilities that these corners had. The first one is our 4th Pittsburgh Steeler, number 47, Mel Blount. He was a big physical corner, 6'2", 210, the size of safeties today, but he was a corner, and he physically dominated wide receivers. In fact, they have a rule for him. Unofficially, it's known as the Mel Blount rule, but it's the illegal contact rule, where defensive players cannot contact receivers more than 5 yards downfield. Because he was so big and so strong compared to a lot of wide receivers in the 70s that he prevented them really from running their routes, and in a sense was at times holding them. But he was so physical, he could give them a shot downfield and knock them out of bounds, knock them off their feet, and basically they wouldn't be an option for the quarterback, which is why they have that 5-yard illegal contact rule. The next, you have Willie Brown, number 24 of the Oakland Raiders. In football lore, he's best known for an interception return for a touchdown against the Minnesota Vikings in the Super Bowl. The announcer is calling the play as he's returning it, and the announcer goes, "Old man Willie, taking it down for a touchdown," or however the announcer says it. But he's referred to as Old Man Willie. But he belongs in this list not because of that one play or because he was a good corner for a lot of years. He was the first real bump and run corner, where playing man coverage, he's lined up on the line of scrimmage right across from the receiver and hits the receiver right as the ball is snapped, is what is now called press coverage, being up into the face of the receiver, trying to knock him off his route, trying to delay him, disrupt the timing of the play. He was really the first corner to really do that. And that's why he belongs in this upper room or icon room. Next, you have number 28, Darrell Green of the Washington Redskins of the 1980s. A little bit on the small side for a corner, about 5'10", 180, 185. But for a decade, he was the fastest man in the NFL. Receivers did not run by him. Oftentimes, he had touchdown-saving tackles, or sometimes game-saving tackles. down the field. One big drawback was his height, so if you had bigger receivers as we got into the end of the 80s and into the early 90s, they could at times out-physical him, not very often, but they could use their height advantage over him and catch passes over him. But for most of the 80s, he was rarely tested because he could break on the ball great, and nobody got behind him because he could simply run faster than them. Next, you have number 81, Dick Night Train Lane of the Detroit Lions, pre-Super Bowl era. He still holds an NFL record with 14 interceptions in his rookie season. That was a time when the NFL only played 14 games. I think that's a record that may never be broken because of the way teams play the game now. Not as many deeper passes, more of the bubble screens and the short 5 and 10-yard routes. Unless you have a great corner that can jump those routes on a consistent basis, I think that 14 interception record will never be touched. But he's also known for getting the clothesline tackle banned in the NFL. That's now a 15-yard unnecessary roughness penalty. But he would take down receivers. He'd come in a sense, from the blind side. If a ball carrier or a receiver is focused on another defensive player, he would come in, clothesline them, upper shoulder area, the throat area, and take them down. Besides those violent tackles, though, he was a good cover corner, as evidenced by the 14 interceptions his rookie year. He didn't have a lot of interceptions after that because teams simply didn't throw his direction. Next, you have on the bottom of the list, number 24, Darrelle Revis. Played most of his career and was drafted by the New York Jets. Bounced around and played with a few other teams later in his career in the quest for that elusive Super Bowl ring. He became known for Revis Island. He simply shut down teams' best receivers in a much better way than what even a lot of the corners today are shutting them down. But he took it to another level. Oftentimes the best receiver on the other team was a decoy for a good portion of the game, and oftentimes the stat line is 1 catch for 8 yards. He totally shut down one part of the field or one receiver. That allowed his teams to be better defensively. Next, in the top right, you have number 21, Deion Sanders. Prime time. He was in the mid-80s, probably the best real cover shutdown corner like a Darrelle Revis, but prime was earlier. He was also a great return man. For a long time, had the fastest 40-yard dash at the NFL Combine at 4.2 seconds and change. Prime even played a little bit of offense towards the end of his career as a wide receiver with both the Cowboys and the 49ers a little bit. He was a great all-around athlete, but he was a cover corner. Difference between him and Revis was a little bit more willing to come up and support the run. One of the few knocks on Sanders was the fact that he wasn't an aggressive run defender. He wouldn't come up and make the big hit. He wasn't looking to come up and make that big hit. But your star receiver is going to be taken out of the game. If he got his hands on the ball, whether it was an interception, a punt return, kickoff return, a reception, a reverse, there was a good chance that he could score. He had an unusual type of bump and run coverage that he played. He oftentimes, instead of using both hands on a receiver, would use one to knock him off and then would use the other hand to keep the receiver off balance a little bit longer. Or he'd hit the receiver with one hand first to direct the receiver in the direction that he wanted him to go as the receiver's trying to come off the line of scrimmage. You have to give him credit for his incredible athletic ability. In the early 90s, he was playing with the Atlanta Falcons, but he was also playing for the Atlanta Braves baseball team and helped them get to a World Series and was bouncing back and forth between the two. Sundays, he generally played for the Falcons, and then during the rest of the week, he would play 2 or 3 games during the week for the Atlanta Braves, and then back on the weekend for the Falcons. So a lot of back and forth. Sometimes if both the Falcons and the Braves were playing at home at the same time, he'd play a Saturday game with the Braves and then a Sunday game with the Falcons. So you have to give Sanders credit for being a great athlete, not just a great corner. Lastly, you have Rod Woodson, another big physical corner, 6'2", 6'3", 205 pounds, with the speed of a Sanders or a Dale Green, but the size of a Mel Blount. Big physical corner, wasn't tested a lot because another return ability type of guy. He could take an interception or fumble back for a touchdown. He did return some kicks and punts early in his career, had a couple of touchdowns on those. But another big physical, fast corner, a lot like Darrell Green, but with Green being a little bit smaller, bigger receivers could take advantage of him on a pass in the end zone or a high ball. Rod Woodson was bigger and didn't allow those passes to be completed as much. Next, you have the safeties. The first one is Ken Houston of the Washington Redskins of the 70s. He was really the first ball hawking type of safety, deep middle type of player, just looking for that big interception. And he was a very good safety. I think he's maybe a little questionable in here. Maybe fans of Washington from the 1970s would argue with me on that. But with these other 3 safeties, I think Houston is not necessarily the weak link, but the weakest argument for being in the icon room. The next one you have is Ronnie Lott, number 42 of the San Francisco 49ers. Originally a corner, they moved him to safety. One of the most physical safeties, if not the most physical safety to ever play the game. Routinely dislodged a wide receiver from a ball on a deep pass. He was feared, respected by the opposing teams. Players would rather run a shorter underneath route than go deep on his part of the field because they knew they were going to get hit, and they knew that he was coming. One incident during one of the 49ers playoffs runs of the 80s, Lott broke one of his fingers. I believe it was one of his pinky fingers. Doctors recommended surgery, which would have taken him out for the rest of the playoffs. Instead, he had that end knuckle of that finger amputated so he could continue playing in the playoffs. Also, during the second Super Bowl between the 49ers and the Cincinnati Bengals in the late 80s, Bengals had a very good running back by the name of Ickey Woods, a bigger back, more of a fullback type, thick body, very good runner in his first couple years in the league. Physical, would break a lot of tackles. Early on in the Super Bowl, the Bengals were going for a first down. They had a running play. Lott came up and stoned him, absolutely stopped him cold. I think he might have even lost some yardage on the play. Woods was really never the same back the rest of the game. And some would even argue, following that Super Bowl game, the next few years, he wasn't as physical, wasn't as dominant of a running back because of injuries. Woods' career was cut short, but many people mark that the start of the decline of his career was that big hit by Lott in the Super Bowl. The next safety you have in the bottom right is Troy Polamalu of the Pittsburgh Steelers, the more modern Steelers of the 2000s. Go ahead and check out his highlight tape, making plays all over the field. One of his famous highlights is, I believe they're playing the Tennessee Titans, and the Titans are on the goal line, 1 yard line, 2 yard line, trying to run a quarterback sneak, and Polamalu just simply jumps over everybody and tackles the quarterback for about a 2-3 yard loss. He would routinely line up at the line of scrimmage like he's going to blitz, and a fraction of a second before the ball would snap, he'd sprint back and cover a deep zone. Sometimes he'd do the opposite, slowly, casually walk up, be 10 yards off the line of scrimmage when the ball is snapped, and then sack the quarterback just as the quarterback is getting to the top of his drop. Great physical, athletic safety, a playmaker, and I really encourage you to check out his highlight tape. And last safety is Ed Reed of the Baltimore Ravens, playing alongside Ray Lewis, helping make that defense dominant. Reed was a ball hawk, another deep middle safety, would come up and hit you, physical player. But I would argue that Ed Reed is one of the smartest defensive players to ever play the game, and I would not be remiss as to give him credit as one of the smartest football players to ever play the game. He would routinely, from his deep safety position, recognize the route combinations and would sucker quarterbacks into making bad throws that he would intercept. And we're not just talking the quarterbacks that, played 3 or 4 games or quarterbacks that had, 25 interceptions in a year. He would do this routinely to Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, Ben Roethlisberger, Phillip Rivers, the other good quarterbacks of his time. Oftentimes the way he would do it was he would try to help determine where the ball was going to go. By when the ball was snapped, the receivers start running their routes. Reed would go in one direction, in a sense, trying to open up the field to sucker the quarterback to throw the ball where Reed wanted to go. Quarterback would throw that ball in the direction, and as soon as the quarterback would start their throwing motion, Reed would turn, sprint, and oftentimes get to the ball a couple yards before the ball actually got to the receiver. Great player. I think his coverage skills were beyond underrated. Very physical tackler, very sound tackler. Rarely did you see him missing a tackle. And to top it off, when he got his hands on the ball on an interception or a fumble recovery, there was a good chance he was going to take it all the way for a touchdown. A great presence. I would even argue that Ed Reed is the best safety to ever play the game. Now let's look at the men who coached all these players. Like we said in the first video, we're leaving people out who are not in the Hall of Fame yet. So Bill Belichick, who is pretty much guaranteed to eventually get into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, he's not on this list right now because he's not in the Hall of Fame yet. But these are the coaches that were innovative and led their teams in dominant areas. The first one is Paul Brown, pre-Super Bowl era, but you cannot have a coaching list without Paul Brown. Pro football, what we know as modern today, started with Brown. He was having meetings. He was having classroom sessions. He was the first coach to have his team huddle up before every play. He even tried back in the 60s to have a radio headset in his quarterback's helmet to communicate the plays to him. Otto Graham, who we mentioned in the first episode of The Upper Room, he was Paul Brown's quarterback. He would often talk about when they tried to use this communicator, Graham would get half the play and then he'd pick up a local radio station and start getting a rock and roll song or some type of music or whoever was talking on the radio, and he'd only get half the play. So Paul Brown was way ahead of his time trying to do things that we take for granted now with the green dots and the communication systems that offenses and defenses use in both the NFL and college today. But Paul Brown also was aggressive, using the pass as a major offensive weapon, not just as a way to loosen up the defense for his run game. Having Otto Graham, one of the first great quarterbacks in NFL history, to execute his offense. And then, after falling out with Cleveland ownership, which the Cleveland Browns are named after Paul, Mr. Brown then went to Cincinnati and started the Cincinnati Bengals organization that his family still runs. So he is definitely, not just alphabetically, but should be the first great coach mentioned in the icon room. Next, you have Tom Landry of the Dallas Cowboys, not just a great Cowboys coach for the 70s and the 80s with the Super Bowl wins. Landry was a defensive innovator. As a defensive coordinator for the Giants in the 60s, he came up with the 3-4 defense. Nobody played a 3-4 defense at the time. You played 4 defensive linemen, 5 defensive linemen, even 6 defensive linemen. Tom Landry changed it, put just 3 defensive linemen on the field, 4 speed guys at linebacker. So Landry is great that way. But then in the 70s, he created the flex defense, which helped make a star out of Randy White. In the flex defense, one of the defensive tackles would line up a yard or two farther off the line of scrimmage to combat the traps and the pulls that were part of the run game common in the 1970s. Took a while for teams to figure out that defense, but along with the great players he had like Randy White and Ed Too Tall Jones, that created the doomsday defense that helped the Cowboys win Super Bowl 12. Next, you have Vince Lombardi of the Packers, obviously an icon because the Super Bowl trophy is named after him. He demanded nothing but the best of his players. All of his players have said he was incredibly hard on them, but they all respected him. And one of the great moments, I think, of showing Lombardi's care for his players was after the Ice Bowl game when the Packers beat the Cowboys on a quarterback sneak by Bart Starr. They talked about the block by Jerry Kramer, that Kramer was able to get under the defensive tackle in front of him and allow Bart Starr to get in the end zone for the game-winning touchdown with just seconds left. There's a clip of Vince Lombardi talking with a reporter after the game. He gets to see the highlight of the play, and he talks about how they talk about the block by Jerry Kramer, and Lombardi says that's a fine block. Kramer said that's one of the best, that's the most significant compliment Lombardi ever gave to him. He was that old school type of coach where you yell at a player more than pat him on the back, but a comment like that stuck with the player. Well, Lombardi was also a strategist. John Madden once commented that he watched Vince Lombardi talk for 8 hours about one play, the Packer power sweep. 8 hours about one play. Not a lot of coaches can do that. Next, you have Chuck Noll, head coach of the Steelers in the 70s with the Steel Curtain defense and the 4 Super Bowl wins. He managed all those different personalities, was more of a defensive coach, used the run game to complement that physically dominant defense, and was a great coach. Several of his assistants became good coaches in their own right, and the schemes that were used by him eventually percolated throughout the league. Next, you have Don Shula, winningest coach in NFL history. But I think one thing that is underrated about Shula was his adaptability. In the 70s, he had a great running back combination led by Larry Zonka. They had a great defense. The Super Bowl season where Dolphins went undefeated, only undefeated Super Bowl champion. I watched, I don't remember what it was, a documentary about the team at the time. But in those 17 games through the Super Bowl run, he only made 13 or 14 mental mistakes. He demanded that type of excellence, not just from his offensive players, but from his defensive players. That led them to their long success. You don't win 340 plus games, I think it's 347 games, by accident in the NFL. But his adaptability was shown in the 80s when they drafted Dan Marino. Shula went from a run-oriented defensive scheme, like most of the teams of the 70s, to the throw it around the field, kind of a spread offense, passing offense under the great Dan Marino, which, as I said in part 1 of this video, led us to the modern football air attacks that we see today. Shula, even though he did make a Super Bowl after the 1984 season with Marino, still was winning. The teams are still in the playoffs more often than not, and we have to give him credit for his innovation. And the last great coach here is Bill Walsh of the 80s 49ers. He was an assistant under Paul Brown in Cincinnati. When Brown was going to step down, many people expected Bill Walsh to be named the head coach of the Cincinnati Bengals. There are stories out there that Brown was jealous of Bill Walsh's success. Whether these are true or not depends on your source. But in any case, Bill Walsh did not get the job with the Cincinnati Bengals. He eventually landed with a very bad San Francisco 49ers team and began to change them and evolved what became known as the West Coast offense. But it started in Cincinnati. They had a great quarterback by the name of Greg Cook. Some sports writers from the time argue that if Cook hadn't gotten injured, he might have been the greatest quarterback in NFL history. Injured his shoulder, rotator cuff, and at that time, the rotator cuff surgery, sometimes the repair surgery, was just as bad as the injury itself. So Cook's career was shortened. And the quarterback they had behind him was a smaller quarterback, didn't have a big arm, but he was good at reading defenses and had a quick release. Bill Walsh used that to horizontally stretch the defense and use the short passing game as an extension of the running game, which became known as the West Coast offense. That led him to 3 Super Bowl championships, 2 over the Cincinnati Bengals, his first and his last, and 1 in between over the Miami Dolphins. But Bill Walsh also preached the toughness. He often would tell his teams, you don't have to prove that you're tough. You're in the NFL. So that means that you're tough. You don't have to prove that, but you do have to prove that you're smart. And he was so knowledgeable about timing for quarterbacks and in the passing game. It is often said that all he needed to see was the feet of the quarterback on a play, and he could tell you if the pass was completed or not. And more often than not, he was right. He also said that to really know if a quarterback can play in the NFL, they need to have approximately 22 starts. If a quarterback doesn't seem to be able to play by 22 starts, which is about a season and a half, then he can't play in the NFL. That was Bill Walsh's idea. Some coaches are finding that, sticking with that, or using that as a benchmark for their young quarterbacks. But these are the great coaches that Pro Football Talk in their article said should be in the upper room or the icon room. They also included Bill Belichick. Belichick will get there, but for our purposes, I only included players and coaches that were already in the Hall of Fame. But there's somebody that they omitted. And I think that the Pro Football Talk article needs to acknowledge the great man that was John Madden. Depending on your generation, Madden spanned 3 generations of football fans. He was the head coach of the Oakland Raiders in the 70s. He won 1 Super Bowl with them, missed out on a few others because of the Steelers and the Dolphins. I mean, Madden coached against Chuck Noll and Don Shula in the 70s, and those 3 butted heads trying to get to Super Bowls. Following his coaching career, he moved on to become a broadcaster. My generation remembers him as a broadcaster. I think the thing that set him apart was he talked like a normal person. He said, instead of the right guard or the left tackle or whatever, he said this guy or that guy. And he made sound effects, boom, zing, whatever. But he made it fun to watch the game. He and his partner, Pat Summerall. Pat was kind of the straight man, the subtle guy, more of a monotone type of voice, where Madden was the crazy, energetic man. They would have made a good coaching combo. The one steady-handed, the one with all the energy. And they were great to listen to. If you were watching your game on a Sunday and Summerall and Madden were broadcasting the game, then you knew that your team's game was a big game. And Madden turned on a lot of fans, not just younger fans, but many women, because he explained the game in a way that wasn't ever really explained to women before. He explained it to people. He made it simple enough so that even people who weren't football fans could understand it, but it was still complex enough where people who are into football could learn something. And then the most recent generations, the video games, started out with Madden football games, which is now, you say Madden to younger generation, they immediately think video games. This youngest generation, the teens and 20s, people of today, they can look at him and see the video games, but have them go check him out on YouTube about the teams that he coached, about his job as an announcer. I think he's one of the great announcers of all time, and definitely an omission from this upper room or icon room of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Even after his announcing was done, if there was a major decision to be made by Commissioner Roger Goodell, Goodell would talk with the owners. But before he made any announcement, he always called Madden to get his opinion. And if Madden's opinion was different from the owners, Goodell would go back to the owners, tell them what Madden said, and they would further discuss it. So I think John Madden deserves to be in this icon room also. So how do we determine who gets here? Well, I think that there should be a committee made up of Pro Football Hall of Fame players and coaches. Let's leave the sports writers out of it. Let's leave the owners out of it. And have the players and coaches, especially ones that were mentioned for this upper room or this icon room, have them discuss who should join them. Because it's the players who know whether or not the guys they competed against were on their level and should be included with them. It's the coaches who would know if they had a player that was difficult to scheme against. if they had a player that was the dominant force on the offense or defense? Should they belong in that upper room? So I think it's the players and coaches that should make those determinations, not the sports writers, not any other type of outside committee. Should only be the ones that belong, the ones in the know, so to speak. So that's all for part 2 of the upper room or icon room for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Don't forget to check out the Pro Football Talk article about this. And don't forget to check out episode 1 of this video, or the first part of this video, for the offensive players and the specialists. This has been the Teaching Football Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Debates. Thank you for watching and sharing with your family and friends. Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and we'll see you on our next episode.